My first guest on the program is Rex Patrick, Centre Alliance Senator. Thanks very much for your time. Why don't we just start with a quick question on this speech from Scott Morrison, from what you've heard so far about, we've had a few announcements from the government and their response going forward to the next fire season. Are they getting the approach right here?
Well, I think it's proper for us to look at additional measures. No question that we could have perhaps resourced our firefighters, who did a fantastic job. We could have resourced them better. And there's, in terms of things like new aircraft, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to buy a national fleet ourselves. I've spoken to people who provide aerial firefighting services, and their view is just give us contracts that are longer than 3 years, and that will enable us to go to a bank and actually buy the aircraft ourselves. And you can put a right of first call on those contracts, so those aircraft are always available in Australia first.
Okay, that's interesting. So not necessarily having to buy them, but ensuring they're here, I suppose, and not stuck in the snow and the ice in Canada or somewhere when they tried to call them out at the last minute. What about the climate change response itself? It seems if that's coming, it will be separate. Is that fair enough?
Well, look, there's no question that climate change has contributed to the fire risk, and it's good to see the government finally reacting. It's taken a major bushfire disaster to cause that. They do need to look at a number of policies, not just associated with firefighting, that do relate to climate change.
Moving on to the Bridget McKenzie situation. So this inquiry is set to go ahead, just confirming Centre Alliance will support that inquiry. To what extent should that scope go into? Should it include other ministers, and should as well staffers, for example, from the Prime Minister's office be asked to give evidence?
Look, there are broad-ranging needs in terms of things that we have to look at. We basically need to look at the whole program, how it was set up, the guidelines, and indeed were those guidelines followed, and what roles did people play. Now, clearly, ministers need to provide answers. I'm certainly not critical of MPs who stand up and say, my electorate needs something. We do that all the time. Centre Alliance does that for South Australia. In fact, it's our job is to advocate for our state, but we never expect contracts or grants to be awarded in a manner that's unlawful. So, people who have been advocating for their region, absolutely, they're doing their job.
But what about the role of the Prime Minister's office as an example? Do you think that should be fair game? It's not often the Prime Minister himself that sort of intervenes, that he does have a big office. Do we need to know any role they had in deciding this targeting of marginal seats?
Well, the nature of the inquiry is looking at political interference in the process. And it doesn't matter whether that political interference comes from the Sports Minister or indeed other ministers exerting influence. I mean, one of the most disturbing things that I've seen over the last few days in relation to this scandal is the sheet that was presented in the Minister's office that had colour-coded lists based on whether an electorate was Liberal, Labor or Green, and that is just not an appropriate consideration. It tells you something's very wrong just by looking at that piece of paper. That should not have been on that list.
So, but just clarifying the scope of this, would we be talking about involvement within the Prime Minister's office and them personally required to either respond to questions in some way? Would you want to hear from them, their involvement, their directions?
Well, the way this works is that you might have a term of reference that looks at political interference, and then it's left to the Senate committee to decide exactly where that needs to go. And normally that's done on the basis of input from both the government and indeed outside parties. I would be very surprised if they didn't go on, if the committee didn't go and look at those areas, and I would be supportive based on the evidence that I've seen.
You would be, okay. And if the Minister is sacked between now and then, would that change anything to do with the inquiry?
Look, we'd have to look at what the government's response is. Obviously, that would take away a lot of the heat from this issue. We live in a Westminster system of government where the minister is responsible for all actions. And, you know, I've spoken to some coalition ministers who have told me they certainly wouldn't have succumbed to pressure and conducted the business in the way that it looks like Bridget McKenzie did.
You've been critical of the government or the Border Force, perhaps, response to the coronavirus. You're saying it's inadequate. I want to run through a few of the claims you're making. You're saying the Australian government is not making direct contact using passenger arrival card info with people who arrived in Australia directly from Wuhan prior to the Chinese government banning flights. What do you know about this for certain, about what is or isn't happening here?
Well, I'll just start off by saying I don't think the government has been reactive or proactive in this arrangement. I don't actually attribute any blame to Border Force. They simply do as they are instructed. Now, in relation to some of the suggestions that I made yesterday by way of a media release, and you've just touched on one of the suggestions, that media release was informed by a briefing that my colleague Senator Sterling Griff and I had from the Chief Medical Officer on Monday night.
Right, so you think everyone with a passenger arrival card info that's come directly from Wuhan would be contacted now by the Australian government? You don't think there's been any contact thus far?
I don't believe there has, and we have a sort of an ironic situation where we have a ban of, we've now got a ban of people flying from Wuhan. We've got Wuhan locked down, and yet we know that there are people in Australia that have arrived from that province in within the incubation period. Now, anyone who's flown to Australia over the last 10 years will know that when they fill out a passenger arrival card, they provide contact details, and it just seems extraordinary when we've got the Chinese acting in the way that they have, which is quite forceful lockdown, containment of people from Wuhan, that we simply are not contacting those that we know have arrived from that district. And indeed, we know that Border Force is not asking people as they arrive from other cities in China now whether or not they have come from Wuhan. And even if they did, the response from our government would be to hand them a pamphlet and let them out into the community. Just seems at odds with how China is handling the situation.
The government response so far on a lot of this is essentially to say we are taking advice from agencies, Chief Medical Officer and so on. There's no reason to believe they're not. Is it the agencies themselves you're critical of?
It's about risk appetite. Now, we've seen a situation where I mentioned before, where it's the Chinese president that stopped flights from Wuhan, not the Prime Minister. We've seen a situation in the last 24 hours where Australia has upgraded its travel advisory to China, but only after the United States, the UK and Germany changed their advice. We've got a strange situation that developed yesterday where school principals acting in the best interest of their students'
Fair
welfare.
enough, and look, and that's something we're asking the government as well. But as I said, they keep saying, well, this is the advice we get. By definition, you must be criticising departments within Australia for their risk appetite, as you called it. That must be the case, because the Australian government keeps saying we're doing what they're telling us to do.
We should be approaching this with a glass half empty view. This is quite a serious situation. I'm an optimist. I do look at things with a glass half full view, but in this sort of circumstance, precaution is a better approach, foresight rather than hindsight.